All right, welcome back everyone. Hope you're all settled in. You had a nice cuppa, bit of a break. We're going into the next session. So the next session is going to be Professor Lin Fritschi. She's our keynote speaker, and I'm just going to give you a little introduction to who Lin is, and then I'm going to hand it over to Lin to take you through her presentation. So Professor Fritschi is an epidemiologist. Who knew we'd get familiar with that word? But here we are, and an internationally renowned specialist in occupational causes of cancer and a distinguished professor at Curtin University. She has a medical degree from the University of Queensland, a doctorate in epidemiology from the Australian National University, is a public health physician with the Royal Australasian College of Physicians, and a fellow of the Australian Academy of Health and Medical Sciences. She's also studied improving the way we assess historical exposures to chemicals at work, and has developed a web-based application that assesses the occupational exposure through epidemiological studies. She's published over 300 peer-reviewed publications in national and international journals. So it is an absolute honour for us today to have such a distinguished and knowledgeable speaker. And just a reminder, if you have questions, you can type them in the Q&A box, and we will be asking them to Lin and our other panel presenters after her presentation. So I'm going to hand it over to Lin now.
Thanks, Will. And I'd like to thank the organisers for inviting me today. It's really great to be able to talk to you. It would have been greater to be there with you and to be able to talk over cups of tea and coffee and get to know you a bit, but alas, that's not going to happen. So let me start. I'm going to talk about the H in HSRs, which stands for health. And what I'm going to talk about is, firstly, I'm going to try and frame a little bit about the health and safety dichotomy that we have in our area, then outline some of the work-related diseases that relate to the health part of HSRs, and then talk about the amount of information that's out there and how you can give you some suggested approaches as to how you can deal with this kind of information, give you a sort of a structure for how to deal with any issues that you might have at work. And finally, a summary. So there's lots of acronyms that we have for our work, but most of them have the words health and safety in them somewhere along the line. And this is because the big issue here is about health versus safety. Safety is all about preventing injury, and health is all about preventing disease. So we have injuries, and in order to prevent them, we need to look at the issues of safety and make a safe workplace. If we want to have a healthy workplace, we need to prevent disease. And what we think about with regards to prevention is trying to break the connection between an exposure and an outcome. What we want to do is say, okay, we've got this exposure that we know leads to this outcome. We need to understand how that exposure leads to the outcome, and that's looking backwards. That's what people like me do, and we look at exposure in the past and look at what outcomes it's led to. But what we do when we're working in the health and safety area is we need to identify what the exposures are and what the outcomes could be, and then we also need to prevent those. So when it comes to injury and safety, it's relatively easy. Of course, it's not always simple, but it is relatively easy to understand how someone has injured themselves and how you can make a place safer. For example, you usually have the same workplace and maybe even the same situation exactly as it was when the injury occurred. It's and the workplace is still there. The circumstances in which the injury occurred are quite clear. And so it's relatively easy to analyse that and to identify what it was that went wrong that caused the injury and to prevent those injuries in the past. And better still, you can analyse a workplace and say, okay, I know that these types of injury can occur. How can I prevent them? So because of that immediacy between the injury and the circumstances, it's relatively easy to deal with. It's a little bit different when it comes to diseases because they're a lot more difficult to link in time. There's often a long time exposure between the cause and the disease. So, for example, with asbestos and mesothelioma, that can be decades between when the asbestos exposure occurred and when the outcome happens, the mesothelioma. There also might be many possible causes for most diseases. So someone might have worked in many different occupations over their time. They might have been exposed to many different chemicals and circumstances which might cause disease, but they've also got non-occupational factors in their lives, such as smoking, such as air pollution, things that otherwise might cause their diseases. Thirdly, there's no real signs in a disease. If you look at a lung cancer under a microscope, you can't really tell whether it's due to exposure to diesel exhaust at work or exposure to smoking at home. There's no signs in the actual disease that tell you what the causes are. There's also the fact that many diseases are very rare. So even some of the more common cancers are still, in the scheme of things, quite rare. Mesothelioma is a very rare cancer. So it's in only 1 or 2 per million people get it. So if you had a small workplace and you had one case of mesothelioma, it might just be chance, or it might be something in the workplace. It's really hard to decide. And lastly, there are many, many different diseases and many different exposures which cause them. And that makes things really confusing and difficult to understand. Another problem we have is that a lot of people out there, not you obviously, but a lot of people out there, this is about the many different diseases first. These are some of the diseases that can be caused by work. And of course, many of them, you look at them and a lot of them can be caused by other cases as well. A lot of them have this long gap between what the exposure was and what the outcome has. Each one of those lines has multiple things within it. So cancer has lung cancer, bladder cancer, breast cancer. So it's really complicated from that point of view. Another problem is a lot of our colleagues or a lot of our friends might think that occupational diseases are solved. So the picture on the left is a picture from the 1950s in the US, and you can see this happy man looking at the pile of asbestos coming out of his machine. No PPE, no protection from the asbestos at all. And a lot of people in Australia think that is not the case anywhere in the world anymore. But you can see the picture on the right. This is a picture of a worker in Indonesia, almost exactly the same as was 70 years ago in the US. But it's not just overseas in poor countries where the problem is. We have that problem here as well. I mean, we've known about silica and how silica can cause silicosis for over 100 years. We've known how to prevent it for over 100 years. And yet we have had this epidemic of silicosis recently because of the artificial stone which is being used for kitchen bench tops. And this is a major failure of the health and safety system, because something like this should not be happening in Australia. And the fact that it is a real wake-up call about what we should be doing in health and safety and how we do need to keep our vigilance up about diseases. So really, how important are work-related diseases? There's really extraordinarily poor information on this. There are some estimates worldwide, and they suggest that about 400,000 occupational injury deaths occur a year over the whole of the world. And the estimates suggest that 4 times as many, so 1.6 million occupational disease deaths occur internationally as well. These are almost certainly a major underestimate. So the best estimates in Australia, we have to use the injury deaths work, because we know the number of deaths. That's very well reported by all the WorkSafes and Safe Work. It's very well reported. And we know there are about 200 occupational injury deaths a year, which is quite a tragedy in itself. But if we apply the global ratio to that 200, there's probably at least 800 occupational disease deaths per year. And where are these diseases? we don't know because we don't have good compensation data. The only information we have on diseases is from our compensation data. There are about 100,000 occupational injuries, serious compensation claims a year, but there are only about 15,000 occupational disease serious compensation claims per year. And you can see on the right that most of them are for mental health conditions. Very few other diseases are being compensated in our current system. If you look at the bottom, you can see that about 65 cancers per year are compensated by the compensation system in Australia. So we know that there are about 700 cases of mesothelioma every year. We know about 80% of these are occupationally caused. So in fact, there are probably over 500, so about 550 cases of mesothelioma every year that are caused by work. But only 65, all cancers, are compensated per year. And so we're obviously undercounting mesothelioma, and that's a disease that we know very clearly is caused by work. So compensation really undercounts disease, and part of that is because occupational exposures to carcinogens are really not well understood. We calculated a few years ago that we thought there were about 5,000 total new cases of cancer in Australia every year. But so that means that the number of total cases of cancer compensated is less than 8% of the expected number. We think this is due to a lack of awareness of occupational risk factors. So a lot of people don't understand the connection between what's happening at work and a later disease, and difficulties in assigning a specific case, or specifically any disease really, to a particular occupational cause. So the reasons that I raised earlier. One positive step is that in Victoria, recently, Victoria has expanded their definition of workplace deaths. In the past, we really only counted injury deaths, but now we're going to, in Victoria, you're going to increase the number of circumstances that are included in the workplace deaths, and that includes deaths from industrial diseases such as silicosis, which is a really positive thing. I hope it spreads to the rest of Australia, because we need to, unless you know the scope of the problem, you can't do much to control it. So now I want to talk about the amount of information that's out there about these. As I said before, there's lots of different diseases. For each disease, there's lots of different exposures. So lots of different jobs out there, and different jobs have different exposures, which result in different diseases. And there's lots of changes over time. So a circumstance that was there 20 years ago may not be there now, but new risks arise, such as the artificial stone. So the International Agency for Research in Cancer did this infographic, which is I put this up here to show how complicated it is, not for you to necessarily understand. Each of those red lines is a chemical which causes the cancer that it's linked to in this picture. And behind each one of those connections between one red line and one disease is probably 50, 100, 200 academic articles. So there's so much information that it is just impossible for you to understand it. But luckily, the IARC and other people like this do these sort of pieces of work where they get experts together and they determine what is the association between a chemical and an outcome. Excuse me. The other issue is that even if you just tried to look at the chemicals that are involved in, let's just say, let's look at lung cancer. Let's not look at everything. There are many, many different chemicals, many, many different circumstances. People are exposed to multiple chemicals in their work. So it is very complicated. So how can we deal with this? So getting back to the primary thing that we're interested in understanding, identifying and prevention. So groups like the IARC, they're the ones that do the work of the understanding. They're the ones that get all that information together and say, this chemical causes this disease. Your role is quite often just to identify and prevent, which is actually the hardest end of the spectrum. So what I suggest, this is my approach, is to first of all work out where you're coming from. What's your focus? What's your problem? Is it a disease in the workplace that you're worried about? Is it cases of disease, or you're particularly worried about a disease in your workplace? Is it about a particular chemical or a particular exposure in your workplace that is happening? Is it that you've perhaps gone to a new job and you want to understand what's happening in that job? So let's start with disease and focus on the disease. So what do you do if there are a number of people with a particular disease in your workplace, and that includes former workers? If you're, the best place to start is with deemed diseases. Some jurisdictions have a list, and in Victoria they're called proclaimed diseases. So these diseases are diseases which, if you have a certain exposure or a certain job, you are then, and you have this particular disease, then it's automatically assumed that that disease is caused by that exposure. So the deemed diseases list is a really good place to start and having a look if you have diseases in your workplace. Excuse me. There's also some specific combinations of exposure disease or job disease which have custom legislation. In Victoria, there's the firefighters legislation. So if you're a firefighter, it's automatically linked to a certain group of cancers. And so again, if you have that job and you have that disease, then that isn't automatically assumed to be associated. Another example is in Queensland, where first responders and PTSD is a specific association that is deemed compensatable. The other one we want to talk about is clusters. Epidemiologists like me really hate the word clusters because it's something that we feel that is really hard to deal with. A cluster is when there's a number of cases of a particular disease in the same workplace. But most of these circumstances where there is a number of diseases in the same workplace turn out to be unrelated to work. So what we have is 3 guidelines to whether a particular problem in a workplace may be a cluster. First of all, you want to look at whether the diseases are the same or they're related types. For example, if they're all leukemias, then it's all one type of cancer, then that might be a cluster. If you've got one breast cancer, one lung cancer, one bladder cancer, then that's unlikely to be related, unlikely to be a cluster because they all have different causes. So first of all, if it's the same disease. Secondly, if there's a higher than expected number of cases in the workplace. So this is where often epidemiologists are called in to estimate if the workplace had the normal rate outside from the community, how many cases would there be, and then how many cases are there actually in the workplace. You have to take into account the age of the workplace. So obviously workplaces with lots of older people have more disease than workplaces with very young people. You have to take into account all the people who used to work there as well, because they might have developed the disease over time as well, and you don't want to miss them. But on the other hand, you don't want to miss the people who didn't get the disease who used to work there as well. And thirdly, you want to see whether there's an environmental exposure in the workplace which might be associated with the disease. So here's an example of when there was a really obvious cluster. This was about a small printing company in Japan. They had 5 cases of gallbladder cancer. Now, gallbladder cancer is an extraordinarily rare cancer. So to have 5 cases in one small printing company was pretty weird. So in this printing company, they had a proof printing room, which was in the basement. It had very poor ventilation. There were 7 machines, and they printed different colours onto their paper over and over again. And each time they printed them, they needed to clean the rollers they used to clean these with these specific solvents. And they did this, they said, 300 to 600 times a day in this small basement stuffy room. And they used two fairly obscure chemicals, 1,2-dichloropropane and dichloromethane, and the estimated exposure concentrations were way over the limit. The place absolutely stank. It was just horrendous. So they went and had a look at all the people who worked in this, who had ever worked in these circumstances, and they found that there were a total of 78 workers who'd worked there, and 17 of them had this very rare gallbladder cancer. So this is a case when it's really obvious that there's a cluster, that something in that workplace is causing these gallbladder cancers, and that these people who got the gallbladder cancers should be compensated, and we should make sure that this doesn't happen again. We should do the prevention. We should do the identification. What other situations might have these chemicals and might lead to prevention in the future? So this is a really obvious cluster. Another obvious cluster, perhaps not quite as obvious, was when suddenly people started seeing cases of silicosis in young male workers in Australia. Silicosis, up until then, there were a handful a year in each state, and these tended to be in older men who'd been working for very long times in silica-related jobs. And suddenly we had these young men who were getting diseases. And this is another time when it really was a cluster. You could tell that for a start, silicosis is quite a rare disease. Secondly, the rate was much higher than it's expected, because over time it suddenly had increased. And thirdly, there was a known exposure in the workplace. So this is another obvious cluster. But these two examples, both of which met those three criteria, are really quite rare. A few years ago, people did some studies of all the cluster investigations which had been done in the US. And they had 567 of them. And they looked and said, how many of these was it a cancer in which it was all the same type, or in this case it was cancers, but cancer which was of all the same type, and they were a higher rate than normal. And out of that 567, only 72 of them actually met those two criteria. So most of these investigations, most of these clusters which worried all the people involved could not be associated with the workplace. Secondly, they then looked at how many of them were associated with an environmental exposure and found that there was only 3 of them. And of them, only 1 actually ended up with everybody who had the disease actually exposed to that chemical. So why is this a problem? I think that there are really clearly some cases where the evidence is overwhelming, like the case of the printing workers and like the case of silicosis with artificial stone. The evidence is really strong, and there's a new workplace cause for the disease. These people should be compensated. Prevention of future cases should be an absolute priority, and that's why we should ban artificial stone. Just thought I'd throw that in here. And in the majority of cases, however, no cause is found. And why is this? This is because they're often, they don't meet some of the 3 criteria. They're often only a small number of cases, so it's hard to investigate from an epidemiological point of view. But there is a downside, because all the people who are involved in this case are worried. They're concerned about themselves, they're concerned about their workmates, they're concerned about their families. They all get worried about what could be happening and what could happen in the future. And people come in, they do the investigation, they say there's nothing here, but it doesn't take that worry away. And so what we're doing is we're adding to the concern without necessarily solving the problem. And I think we need to be really careful not to raise that worry and that concern in people, because that is often doing more harm than good. So to summarise, what do you do if there's a number of people with a particular disease in your workplace, including the former workers? Firstly, check if the disease is a deemed disease, because that really makes things quite easy if that's the case, because that disease is known that that workplace is associated with that disease. And secondly, consider very carefully if there might be a cluster, remembering that it's not always a cluster and you may do more harm than good. So that's when there's diseases in your workplace. Secondly, it's when is an exposure focus useful? So what do we do when we know that we've got a particular hazard in our workplace, and we want ideas on how to reduce the exposures in that workplace? So if you've got a specific known exposure, you can often get some really good information from the web. The unions have a really good website on hazards. WorkSafe Victoria have a really good one. There's information internationally. There's a group called Roadmap on Carcinogens, who collect ways of solving problems. And so they've got a good website as well. So there's lots of information out there. You don't need to reinvent the wheel. And secondly, you might be in the case, so if you know about a particular chemical that is in your workplace. Secondly, you might be in the situation where you want to focus attention on who's exposed to something and what are the problems there. And there is information about this. This is one of our studies that we did a few years ago. And if you wanted to say, okay, well, I need to do a program about reducing diesel engine exhaust, one of the things that's useful is to know that about 30% of the workplace are exposed to diesel engine exhaust, and who's exposed mainly is the farmers, the heavy vehicle drivers, and the miners. So using information like this can really focus your campaign, because numbers really make a difference in those sort of circumstances. So when's an exposure focus is useful is when you know the specific hazard and you want ideas on how to reduce exposure. And firstly, check the union and the regulator sites. There's lots of information out there. And secondly, work out where the priorities lie. So thirdly, I want to talk about when you have a specific job and you want to look at that job in totality and say, what are the problems here? What can we do to prevent disease in our workplace? Even if we don't have cases of workplace disease, even if we just want to do an audit and see what we can do. So if you want to work with a whole industry, there are studies around which have looked at particular industries and said what are the main exposures in these industries. We looked again at carcinogens, so most of my work is on the carcinogens, but you might want to look at heavy vehicle drivers and say, okay, well, the carcinogens there are diesel exhaust and solar UV. There's also information on workplace deaths and workplace diseases and compensation. Unfortunately, most of that, like I said before, is about injury. It's not very good on diseases. But if you want to review a particular workplace to ensure it's healthy, WorkSafe Victoria have got a really nice website where you can just go to the section that says find your industry, and that takes you to your industry, and then that talks about the industry and what the risks there are there. The Health and Safety Executive, which is the WorkSafe Australia version in the UK, you can search for terms that describe your work, so welding or driving, and then a whole lot of information on that particular task or job come up. And lastly, there's the ILO Encyclopedia, so the International Labour Association, and it has extremely detailed and very nice information on certain industries. They do tend to be the traditional old, heavy and dirty industries, so not all industries, but it is a really useful source for information on that. So what do you do when you have a specific workplace or a task and you want to make sure you're preventing disease? You could examine data from large studies and from occupational records such as compensation, or you can look at websites which are job focused and just try and find those websites. A lot of websites are organised by hazard rather than job, but there are good websites that are job focused, and they're good to look at if you want to do an audit of your workplace. So that's all I have to say, really. I think the points I wanted to make here are that work-related diseases still occur in Australia today. They're under-recognised, undercompensated, and they are really important to consider. But as an HSR, you don't need to do the original research to determine if a specific exposure causes a specific disease. That's been done for you. You don't even need to have cases of the disease in order to act. In fact, it's much, much better if you prevent disease happening than if you need to look backwards and try and solve the problems in the past. So you need to know how to find about what diseases are caused by a particular job or exposure. If a worker does have a disease, could it have been caused by an exposure in the workplace? Where those exposures occur and how to prevent the exposures. And that will be a toolbox that you would be able to use and hopefully will help make your workplaces healthier. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you, Lynn. So just a reminder that Professor Fritschi will be on our panel today, on our discussion panel. And she's going to be joined by a couple of other people. We've got Deb Vallance and John Weiladek, and we're going to do a Q&A on hidden hazards in the workplace and what HSRs can do about them. So just by way of introduction, a bit of information, Deb Vallance is the Senior Policy Officer, Work Health and Safety at the Australian Council of Trade Unions based in Melbourne. She's previously worked at a state and national level as a Work Health and Safety Policy Officer with the AMWU. And in recent years, Deb's been at the forefront of coordinating the union movement's national campaigns around particularly asbestos, silica and psychosocial health. And John Weiladek is a Senior Industrial Officer at the Victorian branch of the Australian Education Union. And John played a pivotal role in the union's case to successfully uphold a PIN issued by an HSR at VCAT. And John is able to share with us today, hopefully, some of the lessons and considerations HSRs should take into account when requesting information under Section 69 of the OH&S Act. So don't forget that you can pop your questions in the Q&A box for us to present them to the panellists. But I'm going to start with a couple of questions that will hopefully elicit a bit more information for you today. So the first question goes to Lynn. So Lynn, you talked a lot about the hidden risks to health in the workplace, and lots of employers and also workers and HSRs tend to think of the old mindset around focusing on safety, but not so much on the health piece, which always feels a little bit complicated. So what do you think the biggest time bombs are that are facing Victorian workplaces in the next few years? And then as a follow-up, what could HSRs do to educate their employer, but also their co-workers, on what they might look out for those?
Thanks, Will. I think the two time bombs are probably the silicosis cases from artificial stone, which are going to increase, unfortunately, especially if we don't do something rapidly. But silicosis is a long-term condition, and I think we're going to get a lot more of that, tragically. And secondly, I think long COVID is going to be a problem. It certainly is a big problem in the UK, and they're grappling with how to deal with long COVID there. And that is definitely an occupational disease, particularly for healthcare workers, but also for any kind of public-facing jobs. And I think we're going to get a lot of, as the cases of COVID reduce, we're still going to see this long COVID, which is going to be a major problem for everybody. I guess another big challenge that faces all of us is the non-traditional work structures. So casual gig work, third-party labour, working out where somebody works when every day they're somewhere else, and whose the responsibility is it for the health and safety. We have a lot of migrant workers whose visas depend on their job and who don't want to know whether they have conditions that are a problem. And we have, unfortunately, a non-unionised workforce is increasing, and that's also a problem because unions are a good protection for health and safety. I also think a lot of managers don't necessarily understand OHS, and so I guess I think what health and safety reps can do is really try and bring your knowledge to your managers so that they understand about what it means to have a healthy and a safe workplace.
Now, on the issue of silicosis, why has there been that upswing in cases?
So we brought in a new product, but a product that we knew if we'd just used our brains, we would have known that this was a dangerous product. Um, and but unfortunately, I think the work health and safety regulators have been underfunded for many, many years. They tend to be now, because of that underfunding, they tend to be very reactive rather than proactive. And so they're not going out looking for problems, they're dealing with problems as they arise. And they are really hardworking, but they just can't deal with everything because of the underfunding. Another problem is the small and medium-sized enterprises, which often have no health and safety knowledge. They often don't have a health and safety rep. They often just don't understand that there's a risk in their workplace. And certainly this was the case with artificial stone. A lot of small operators no background at all in cutting stone because it was so easy to cut compared to traditional stone. They didn't have any training. And so what we need really is a much better early warning system, a much better, preferably before people get disease, but more when there's actually a problem occurring that we know about in exposure. And I don't exactly know what that would be, but I think funding the regulators better is a good start, and making sure that there are more health and safety reps better trained in all the workplaces, including small ones.
Well, on that then, I might bring you in, Deb. You spend a lot of time meeting with regulators, work health and safety regulators. What do you think are the gaps in the current legislation? What's the most urgent law that we need to help us address some of these things?
I actually think it's a sort of a mixture of things. The fundamental principles of our laws are fine. What happens is that because in some ways it's focused on the workplace, we then have forgotten some very big public health issues and the way that you deal with public health issues. And so we've lost, we've narrowed down without sort of actually looking out. Now, I just sort of think about the whole silicosis thing for engineered stone workers. The companies that bring in that product are very, very big multinational companies. Those companies knew about the hazards associated with their product. And then, so we didn't have, the system wasn't actually looking at what was coming into the country. We then only sort of picked it up when doctors picked up the problem, whereas the regulators, because they sort of have a traditional focus on safety, didn't actually sort of look at disease. And we do appalling work in terms of our education and our awareness around disease. We don't actually give people, including managers, the tools to actually look at those things. So then if we sort of then narrow it down to what actually we should be doing in our regulations, well, we actually, I mean, Victoria's just about to get it, which is great, but we don't actually have in any of our health and safety regulations. The only regulations that we have around disease are actually around lead and asbestos. We're getting silica once in Victoria, hopefully before the end of the year. But you can see the myriad of and types of diseases and hazards that and risks that happen in workplaces that Lin's outlined, and yet our whole regulatory framework is a framework based on safety. It's not a framework based on health. So that's the fundamental error, in my opinion.
And now, there's been a really big push, particularly in the last few years, to better regulate psychological health. And there's already some questions coming through, in particular around what can HSRs, like, how do they raise psychological health risks in their workplace that means that the employer will actually address the risk at the source? So, you know, there's always been this talk about worker resilience, that it's about building the resilience of workers rather than looking at, for instance, the systems and structures around how work is done as being the kind of causative factor for psychological health injuries, or as Lynn has pointed out, things like insecure work, actually how those things are structured. So what can HSRs do to raise those kinds of issues in a way that means that their employer is actually going to address those things?
The amount of information that's around, and it's backed up by very good research about what are the hazards, what are the risks, what are the risk factors for psychological injury, are very clear. They're provided in guidance that we're hopefully getting them in codes of practice. And so it's actually about looking at your workplace like you do for any physical hazard. I mean, you look to see whether or not there's a risk of falls. So look to see whether or not the rostering system that you've got in place actually means people don't get enough time to travel to and from work and have a proper rest. Do and predict and work out how their lives are going. Do you have enough people are running ragged at work, and this has been very, very big problem in the recent sort of the COVID pandemic. You know, do you actually have enough staff so people can actually do the job that they're asked to do, and can they do it well? Because we all want to be able to do our job well, and so therefore relieves the sort of pressures that are on them. So there's a whole range of, you know, look for the hazards, look for the risks, and then discuss those. I think one of the fundamentals about psychological health is people sort of perceive it as something different to physical health. And sure, its expression is different from physical health, but that's not unusual. We're human beings, we're individuals, we all have very different things that focus on our body, our health. So we don't actually sort of say, oh, well, cigarette smoking doesn't cause cancer because everybody who smokes doesn't die of cancer. It's not, it's the same thing with, you know, people exposed to like vicarious trauma at work, having to, you know, read dreadful things or deal with horrible situations in people's lives. Not everyone will get, you know, crack up. Not everyone will find that their mental health's unhealthy, but a lot of people will. So we've actually just got to sort of go back to the basic principles about health and about looking at for our risks and stuff. And there's a lot of information out there that can actually help you do that. Of course, there's the training that you can get as a health and safety rep. And I think one of the big fundamentals is actually about educating our managers. Australia has a very poor record in terms of the quality of our management, and I think that really also plays out when it comes to health and safety.
Deb and Lynn have given us some insights into the things that you should be thinking about when you have concerns about risks in your workplace. Now, under Section 69 of the OH&S Act, employers have to allow HSRs for a designated work group access to information that the employer has relating to actual or potential hazards arising from the employer's undertaking. So what should you do if your employer refuses to hand that information over?
Yeah, so thanks, Will. So this is something that at the AU, one of our HSRs at a school confronted. What happened in that case, the risk to health and safety, probably more so to safety, was a aggressive student, and various reports had been logged on the school's safety, health and safety incident logging system, but the HSR inquired about those documents and that information, but the school didn't allow him to access it. And one of the key things they said was, well, this relates to the private information of the student, and well, you're not going to be allowed to have it. So the HSR sought internal review through WorkSafe of that decision, and yet again it got bounced back, and the WorkSafe internal review unit said that you're not allowed to access it. So the union decided to take the matter further and seek a review of it in VCAT. And this year, in June, there's a decision. It's called Griffiths and the Victorian Work Cover Authority. The VCAT handed down its decision and said, no, you are allowed to have information that an employer has, as long as it relates to a health and safety incident or an issue at the workplace. It is subject to some limitations, but the real important, I suppose, facet of the decision is that if you have that if the information that the HSR is seeking has that connection to a health incident, a safety incident, and really into that framework that Lynn spoke about earlier about information that helps you understand, identify, or prevent a risk to health or a risk to safety, well, then you are entitled to it. Some of the limitations are things about, for example, private health information. So there'd probably be some limits around whether an HSR could seek, the private medical records of another employee, a co-worker. But aside from the limitations built into the OH&S system, it's a very important and powerful tool for HSRs to be armed with that information so they can help perceive what the risk is, to see what its prevalence is, and to see how it might affect someone, another worker or a visitor or another person at the workplace. So I think it's a useful decision. It was unfortunate that we had to go to VCAT to have all these decisions overturned and ultimately be successful, but hopefully the decision does form a bit of a template as to how activists in this health and safety space can access that information. And I'd just like to emphasise one aspect of it. If you look at what a HSR can do under the Act, under Section 58 of the OH&S Act, there's a lot of powers that are conferred on the HSR. So things like you could go inspect various work practices, inspect machinery, etc., etc. You can establish and participate in committees, you can attend interviews, these sorts of powers. Section 69 is an obligation that an employer has to the HSR. So this is something that this is a duty. This is a duty that's placed on the employer to help the HSR in this function, because if we use, for example, the circumstance that printing company that Lynn described, those particular solvents, those particular chemicals, that information may well be hidden inside the corporate knowledge of the company. How many barrels of it that have they bought? Where is it being kept? How's it being kept? With this type of power under Section 69, you can ask for that information, and they're really obligated to provide it to you. So there are X barrels of it. They're stored over here. They're stored under these conditions, etc., etc. So, focusing on the issue of that it's information to help at HSR do their job. I think it's a powerful tool, and the decision confirms. Fortunately, we were successful, and it confirms the strength of that tool.
Okay. Lynn, I've got a question for you, and I think this is interesting. So you've noted that the most common workers' compensation claim for disease now is mental health injury. So what's the difference between viewing mental health as an injury as opposed to a disease? So if we understand it as a work-related disease, does that change how we understand the causes, etc., as opposed to and describing it as an injury?
Interesting question. Deb might actually be better to answer this than me. It has some features common to injury in that these circumstances are often still there. So there may be ways that you can investigate it sort of at the time. But it also has factors related to disease, which is sort of that long-term issue, and the accumulation of hazard over time, as opposed to a single one-off event. Maybe Deb could say something more useful than that.
I'll just sort of back that up a bit. Then most of it is actually partly the nomenclature that actually happens from how workers' compensation laws are drafted, and that's isn't any indication about health. It's just how the compensation laws are drafted. When we talk about disease, what we tend to think about is something that recovery, it takes a while. And so that's mental health injuries or just sorry, I'll go back. My apologies, everyone. One, the disease may last around in your body for a long time, but also the causes can either be something acute or something that happens over time. So many of the psychological hazards and risks that we face at work are actually things that are cumulative. So it's not because you have one day when you're really tired. It's because you have multiple days over multiple time when you're very tired, you don't get the support at work to back you up, and you end up, burning out. So there's sort of part of it's just the nomenclature, and don't get caught up about that really. What we're talking about is trying to prevent people actually becoming ill, and so ill, whether you use the word injury or disease, it's technical.
All right, so we've had some questions that are around exposure or the kinds of information that an HSR can get. I don't know, John, I'm going to throw this one to you to start with, and then whoever wants to can come in with it. There's been some questions about the information that an HSR can get that is not necessarily, it's things like HR information, de-identified, for example, but information about what's happening in a workplace that doesn't look straight away as if it's directly related to OH&S, but does come into this question, particularly around psychological hazards. And also there's a question around, let's say that your workplace is in a building and there are other tenants in the building. Are you able to access information about what they might be storing on site, or what they might be doing in terms of, essentially, what's the range of information that an HSR can get?
Sure. So I suppose it's a developing area. It'd be a developing area of law in this case. The case that we ran from our research was the first case of this type that the VCAT has considered. So I suppose we are in the initial steps of working out what that information is. But I suppose comparing this legislation to other legislation, for example, like the Fair Work Act. The Fair Work Act stipulates that employees and right of entry permit holders can access certain documents. Well, a document is a different concept to information. Seeking documents is a bit like there's a pay record on site, or there's a particular policy. It really is information reduced to a written form, and that written form of the document is held somewhere. With the OH&S Act, by its use of the expression information, it is broader. So you could say, well, how much of X solvent is held on site? There may be no single document that says that, but somewhere inside the employer's corporate knowledge, that information is held. And if you've made that request, well, I think you've got a good case to have it disclosed to you if it's got that connection to health and safety. Talking about what type of information, what's the requisite connection, it's really just got to be information. I might just see if I can get the right expression here. It's information that has to relate to actual or potential hazards arising from the conduct of the undertaking of the employer and arising from the particular work group the HSR is part of. So when you look at that expression relating to, the courts have adopted a pretty broad approach to that expression relating to. Certainly when we ran the case, we relied on a series of decisions in all sorts of areas of law that state that relating to requires a nexus, but it is a broad nexus. So there just has to be, I think, in practical terms, there's just got to be a logical connection between the information that you're seeking and the actual or potential hazard which you are looking into. So there has to be a logical connection, but it doesn't have to be, directly relevant to, information created for the dominant purpose of X. It doesn't need that stronger relationship. I think part of your question also referred to the issue of, well, what's the situation where you've got a work site or a workplace, a building with other people in it? Section 69 is cast in terms where it really anticipates the sharing of information between the employer and the HSR. So it could be conceivable that the employer doesn't actually hold the information about, say, what's going on levels 7, 8, 9 of the building, which are occupied by a different tenant. That said, if the risk has transmits from those floors somehow, or can for want of a better phrase, leak out from that part of the building or the property into the workplace which the employer controls, well, then you can make inquiries about that risk. But of course, it would then be down to the employer in discharging its own obligations under the OH&S Act to assemble, collate, weigh that sort of risk. And once they start doing that, as they should under the legislation, you can ask to be privy to that type of information. So it is, we all know that it's more prevalent to have work sites with subcontractors and independent contractors and people coming in and off, and far more diverse set of employment relationships at a workplace. But I think if the employer is doing what it ought to be doing, it is gathering up one way or another that information, and once it has it, it can be subject of that process in Section 69.
Okay, I don't know whether Deb, you wanted to add anything to that, or Lynn? Don't have to if you don't want to. No? All right, so I think this one was addressed to you, Lynn, this is particularly in relation, I suspect, to occupational cancer or cancers that arise in workplaces. And it's focused on particularly office, retail and other workers who don't regularly come into contact with chemicals and hazardous substances. Is there anything in those kinds of workplaces that HSRs should be looking out for or watching for that might pose a risk?
From a point of view of cancer, there's usually a dose-response relationship, which means that the more exposure there is, the more likely you are to end up with a cancer. So in that case, your questioner is right. A lot of workplaces that involve just working in an office have low exposure to many chemicals, and so the risk of cancer in those cases is low. There are a few issues that people will need to consider, such as driving as part of the work, such as outdoor work for sun exposure. they're quite common in office workers, particularly driving. A lot of people say they work in an office but actually do work outside and go around the place. So there are some issues to think about, but that's probably the main ones. I guess the other issues would be more in the relation to not so much cancer, but things like air conditioning, making sure that's correct, good air quality, those sort of more general health and safety issues.
Okay, thank you. I have a question here, and I might put this one to Deb. So what's a reasonable response time from an employer if an HSR does ask for information? Like how long before an HSR can legitimately say, come on now, I asked for it, where is it?
Thanks for the difficult question. Really depends on what you're asking for. I mean, if it's information about the accidents or the first aid book, or how many compensation claims, or where's the latest safety data sheet, or, what's the numbers of reports we've had about such and such. All of those things are things that employers should have very close at hand. It's part of their legal obligations. So there should actually be, that should be, within the next couple of shifts or whatever you work in the next couple of days. If it's information that is actually much harder to procure, well, then you really do need to go into a bit of a conversation with them and say, well, where do you have to go and get the information from? Like, for instance, if it's technical guidance about how a particular ventilation system works, I was thinking about that. Well, then maybe they might need to procure some expert advice. And I think the approach that I would say to health and safety reps is it's really about getting the commitment to get something done and tracking that commitment is done. And I hope I can remind people that there's a wonderful things that a consultation record years ago, and I hope is still around, where you record when you've had your discussions with your employer, so that it's actually quite clear that you've had discussion about when or what you can get access to. And could I just sort of follow up a little bit on the question about vent and the thing that Lynn mentioned about office work, or people in sort of buildings most of the day. It's not related to cancer, but given the pandemic and what COVID has actually taught us that we have been ignoring, is really about the whole thing around about clean air at work. And that also became an issue when we had the bushfire smoke and how that, so ventilation systems and how we ventilate our workplaces is really very important. It's going to become much more important in the future, I think.
So I just want to ask, and I don't have this particularly directed at anybody, so I'm going to leave it as a free-for-all. So we've talked a bit about psychological health, and we've talked about the factors. Lynn, you talked about, the status of employment and insecure work, etc. One of the other things that people often will say is it's a hazard in the workplace is around questions of workload. So workload, which then generates stress and psychological issues, but obviously goes to questions about how organisations structure the work, etc. And that's a difficult thing sometimes for HSRs to talk about. So I'm going to, Deb, you're nodding, so I'm going to go to you first because you look like you're ready to give me an answer. What would you say, how would you suggest to an HSR that they might start the process of having the conversation with the employer that says, I think this is a risk factor, what are we going to do about it?
Start back at your basics, talk to your work colleagues, gather interview information from all of the people that you're working with so that you've actually got a fair bit of information and data and questions that need to be, that people are raising. One of the fundamentals that I think is often missed with the way health and safety reps work in workplaces is we often don't collaborate as well as we should with our union delegates. Union delegates are involved in the discussions around rosters, your enterprise agreement, your award has all of those industrial instruments that actually help dictate this stuff. So you really need to talk to your delegates and all sit down and gather your information together and say, okay, what is it that we're actually asking management? Because if you go to management with a really vague thing as, oh, we've got too much work, that actually doesn't, it's easy to fob that off if you're management. So what you need to do is actually collect your information, then actually sit down and think, well, actually, what is it that we want them to look at? Where is it we want to go in terms of a solution? Our solutions might not be all the correct solutions, but at least if we put some ideas up, then management's got something to deal with. So that's actually my first advice on that.
I don't know whether anyone else wants to add something. John?
Just going on from what Deb said, that there, if you think of it, at a workplace, there's lots of that information that Deb was talking about collating, that it is floating around the workplace. You look at things like, well, what are shift rosters doing? What are overtime records doing? Production schedules. All of these things, and I think Deb made a very good point that a lot of those documents and a lot of that information overlaps with what the delegates at the workplace will be doing. And once you put together a shopping list of that information, it does make it harder for the employer to just simply dismiss a complaint as, oh, too much work. It's actually got some meat on the concern, and it's harder for them to just to swipe their wave their hand at it and to say it's not a real issue, when you can show things that may have metrics or have a lot of structure behind it. Then it does create something that employers have got to take seriously.
Which I think goes back to that question that was asked before about how, if you want to gather that information about the metrics, the information that's available to you, in some cases, it's a bit harder to track down, isn't it? Because it will sit in HR records and that kind of thing around absences.
And you could ask something like that with this when you look at these this Section 69 power. A well-aimed email. We are concerned about A, B, and C work practices. We're concerned that this has a workload issue. Could you please provide me absentee record, or how many absentee days there are, or the overtime patterns, or the shift patterns for A, B, and C period. Once you assemble that information, it really strengthens your hand to say that there is a real problem here and it has to be dealt with seriously.
So one of the things that's getting the rousing thumbs up and has over the course of the conference today is whenever we've talked about the fact that having managers who understand OH&S and the rights of HSRs and other things is really critical to making sure that workplaces are safer and that HSRs are able to exercise their powers. So I'm wondering whether anyone has a view about what role can an HSR play in terms of ensuring that their management is educated and understands their role and also the responsibilities that sit with them. I'm going to go to you again, Deb, because you had the misfortune of nodding your head. So that means you sound like you're ready.
A misfortune of my behaviours, unfortunately. I should learn the Angela Merkel approach. The important thing, I think, is actually often you have to remember that you as a health and safety rep are actually really well equipped. You've got a lot of information. Where I used to work previously, we used to advise our health and safety reps, after you've come back from a health and safety course, is actually to sit down with your immediate manager or whoever and say, look, this is what I learned. this is the things that I've learnt that we can do together. This is what I've learnt about how we can do consultation. So you actually are generous and sort of take them on a bit of a journey, as the sort of wording would be these days. And the other thing is actually to recommend to them that to make their job easier, they perhaps should go off and get a Cert 4 or go and get a diploma in health and safety. There's a lot of courses that are available to them. You could also suggest that there's some reading that they could do. There's what's called the Book of Knowledge, which is a sort of pompous title, but anyway, produced by the Old Safety Institute of Australia. And so that is very, a good way of them actually having access to information. So I think all of those things are a way of actually trying to raise their awareness, and also to make sure that they understand that this stuff is actually not difficult if you work together. It's not difficult if you actually sort of use all your talent.
Well, I think Deb might have dropped out on us there for a second. This is always the issue when you do these things online. I'll put this one. So occupational diseases, particularly things like cancer and those sorts of things, are, at the time that people get diagnosed, there's a lot going on, there's a lot they need to do. And there's a question around like the time to lodge a claim for where you believe it's an occupational cancer, that might be too short. John, can you talk us through what the time is, like when do you have to lodge a claim? And in fact, is the fact that time limits are, like, is that a problem for people?
Oh, look! I have to admit, you've got me on the hop a little bit. I'm not an expert in compensation law. That's a little bit outside my area. But what I can say is this: that if you do have a concern about that, there are a lot of a lot of unions have relationships with firms which are experts and specialise in the area of compensation law. Issues relating to occupational diseases are complex and are not straightforward necessarily to run, and especially when you've got questions like when there are long latency periods before any before the aspects of the disease can manifest themselves. That adds to those complexities. But I think the most important thing is that if you do have that. If you are in that situation, it is best to seek expert advice as soon as you can. I know that the issue with time limits, is different for different types of diseases, but that's where what they call in law the statute of limitations. That's the hard sort of stop period in which you cannot bring a claim after. That they are. Different for different types of diseases and sometimes quite complex. As soon as you do think you're in that situation, it is very important to get that sort of expert advice early on. And unions are very, very good, in my experience, at being able to, having come from working for one of those firms to now working in-house for the union. Those firms are very good at providing that type of advice on what you need to know to make a successful claim and how to best protect your rights. That's probably my advice for it.
I don't know whether anyone else wants to add anything to that. Our HSRs who participate in this, they often have quite technical questions because they deal with this stuff every day, and it's the practical stuff that worries them. There's a broader question which I'll put to, I'll start with you, Lynn, and then maybe, I don't know, Deb or John, whether you want to add to it. So it's clear with this kind of longer term thing that we need to start looking at what you describe as the leading OH&S indicators rather than the lagging. So rather than looking at, the number of cases, blah, 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 if there was some way that we could pivot organisations to start looking at the leading indicators that are going to drive us there rather than what's happened, but what will be, that would get better outcomes. So do you have a view about how do you get an organisation to start thinking in that proactive frame rather than reactive frame? I'll put that to you, Lynn. If you don't have an answer, I'll happily see whether either of other panellists do. All right, hang on a second, Lynn. Your feed, your sound's cut out for us. I don't know what that is. I hate to say it, you're probably not on mute. It's probably a technical problem at our end because I think we're so far in the pandemic.
How's that?
That is better.
It was me on mute.
It was you on mute.
Sorry.
That's all right. Fire away.
So I think the emphasis should be about exposure. We shouldn't be looking at disease. We should be looking at exposure. But that's quite complicated and difficult. But there's no reason why we can't start to look at how many people are exposed in a more real-time way. There's lots of new wearables coming out where you can just wear a little dosimeter for a day, not these great big enormous things that often the hygienists carry around, but small dosimeters that are individual and that people can then look at their individual exposures. And it's just about changing people's point of view to say it's not just about counting the people who've had injuries, but it's about counting the people who are also exposed. And I think that's a difficult thing to get across. But if we'd been doing that with in all this silica workshops, we wouldn't have the problem that we have today. So it's about saying to people, instead of saying how many people have got a respiratory disease, you say how many people are exposed to silica in your workshop, and just getting that mindset change, which I admit is not going to be easy.
Deb or John, do you have any views about what HSRs could do to get their organisations to think in a different way about some of these things?
I will just start off with saying it's actually about reminding everyone that the Health and Safety Act is a piece of law that is designed to prevent things happening. So success is actually when nothing happens. Success is when no one's injured, and success is when no one gets ill. And success is often hard to measure. But all of our instruments, all of our guidance, all of our codes of practice, all have tools in them about actually looking for the risks, going and looking for identifying the hazards and actually looking and seeing if we've got some risks. So, like, for example, we've still got an epidemic of noise-induced hearing loss in workplaces. Well, go and measure the noise. Go and see do some basic work about doing the detective work, about looking for the hazard. In terms of psychological hazards, we've got multiple and fantastic risk assessment checklists that are available through many of the regulators and the guidance material, and hopefully soon the codes of practice as well, which actually go and look to see whether you've got the risk. So it's going back to it's going back to the basics and saying, look, your obligation as an employer, your obligation is actually to prevent so far as reasonably practicable. And remember, cost is only one little part of that definition. To actually make sure that we prevent disease, that we actually provide work that's 1, enjoyable, 2, safe, and 3, productive.
John, did you have anything to add to that, or are you happy with that?
No, I think that's a very good summary.
Excellent. All right. I'm going to ask each of you, sorry, I've got one more question. I think, Lynn, I might put this to you. You've addressed issues of dusts, hazardous substances and psychological hazards. Are there any biological hazards in addition to that we should be thinking about?
Yes, there's obviously air-related biological hazards such as Legionnaires. So in the air, there's water and soil issues that may come up, but are less common probably. In healthcare work and other works like that, there's bloodborne diseases from needle sticks and things, and contact with body fluids. So there are quite a lot of hazards, and we're probably the healthcare workers are quite well aware of these, and needle sticks have to be reported and things like bodily fluid. Everyone wears gloves and things, so that's a big issue. But I guess other people are animal workers with zoonoses, diseases you can catch from animals, and there are quite a lot of biological hazards out there. I'm not quite sure what you want me to say about that. Sorry.
I think the question around that, I suspect it's people in particular industries who know what those risks are. So I might just do a follow-on question then to either Deb or John, which is if you're an HSR in an industry where you know that that those risks are likely to be there, what would be the things that you would do to kind of mitigate against those risks?
Sorry, that's actually really going to depend on the sort of work that you're doing and the industry you're coming from. For example, what happens in the meat industry with exposure to bodily fluids from animals and carcasses is going to be very different to what you would be doing in a nursery to make sure that all of the potting mixes that you were using weren't a potential source of things. So sorry, my response is very vague because it really depends on the circumstances about what it is that you're looking for. So it's a basic information searching, really.
So I think the questioner was really kind of wanting to point out that we talked about a number of risks, and there was this one other risk area that we just needed to touch on when we talk about these kinds of diseases and injuries that arise, the cancers and other things. All right, I'm going to ask you one final question each. If there was one key piece of advice that you wanted the HSRs attending today to take back to their workplace, what would it be? And because you're on my screen in this order, I'm going to start with John at the far end and work my way in to Deb and then Lynn. So if you had one key piece of advice, what would that be?
Okay, so I think far and away for an HSR to operate as effectively as possible in the workplace with these types of safety issues, if you can keep good notes about what's going on at the workplace, and ensure that you've got good email communications and keep a copy of all those records for future reference. That was a key aspect of the case that we had. A good note or a good email down the track can be very, very valuable.
Deb, key piece of advice that you want people to take back with them when they finish up today. What's the thing you want them really to remember?
I'm sorry, I couldn't have had grave trouble hearing John, so I may be repeating.
That's all right. Repetition is fine, because if it's important, it's important. Go ahead.
Okay, so my advice is really not related to the topic, but it's related to basically working as a team with your co-workers and your union delegates and your other health and safety risks. You get much better results when you work as a team.
It's almost like you watched this morning's session with the our HSRs from Crown Casino, where I think that was their number one message too. Lynn, if there was one thing that the HSRs who are watching today could take with them from today, what would you want that to be?
First, I think a thank you, because I think your job is really important, and it's really vital in our structure that we have people on the floor who are doing the HSR job. So it's a big thank you is one big message. And the second one, I guess, from my point of view, is don't forget the health issue of the Don't forget the H in HSR.
All right, so let's not just be reactive, let's start looking at the proactive measures. All right, on behalf of everybody who's attended today, I want to thank our three panellists for coming today, for being happy to answer whatever questions we put to them, and in particular to Lynn for her presentation today, which I think re-emphasised for everybody the importance of that H in the HSR, that, you know, we're looking at diseases and things that are caused through work that are not necessarily just the simple, straightforward injury. So I want to thank all three of them for attending today. Normally, if we had everybody here, there'd be a nice big round of applause and then you could wander off. But on just behalf of all of the HSRs, thank you to all three of you. I'm going to do a wrap up now, which is going to take us into the glories of your lunch break. So the first thing, after lunch, we're going to have a break, and we're going to ask you to be back at 1 o'clock on the dot, and we're going to split at that time into different breakup sessions. So you should be able to access the breakout sessions on the conference portal. And in the breakout sessions, you're going to have a chance to debrief on what we've talked about today, apply the skills and ideas, and also ask any questions that you might have about issues that you might encounter at your workplace. Also, before you go, I want to talk to you about an event that we've got coming up at Trades Hall. So next Wednesday, the VTHC Occupational Health and Safety team are going to be joined in conversation by Clayton Larkin. He's a WorkSafe inspector with the representation support team. So there were lots of questions this morning, and there have continued to be questions about what you expect when someone from WorkSafe shows up, when a WorkSafe inspector shows up. What should you have for them? What can you expect of them when they come? And so Clayton's going to be talking about what to expect when an inspector shows up at your workplace. So you can tune into that live show. It'll run for about an hour, and you can tune into it on the OH&S Reps Facebook page at 6 p.m. on Wednesday, November 3rd. And it'll run very much like today, where you'll actually be able to ask questions of Clayton in the chat that he can then answer for you, which hopefully arms you with a bit of information about what to expect with that. And then the last thing I just want to say to you is that all of the conference materials and the videos are going to be put up on that the We Are Union OHS Reps website. So if you're wanting, A, if you're having trouble with some of the tech today, or B, if you just want to go back and refresh yourself about what you've seen today, just go to that, the We Are Union OHS Reps website. You can check it all out there. So I'm going to wrap up this morning's session. You get an extra 3 minutes to your lunchtime, so enjoy. We will see you back here at 1 o'clock for the breakout sessions. Awesome, we'll see you then.